David sat on his couch, staring at the blank TV screen. 3 months ago, he had a job, a girlfriend, and plans for the future. Now he had nothing but empty pizza boxes and a stack of rejection letters. The small apartment he moved into felt like a cage, but going outside seemed impossible. What was the point anyway? Every morning, David would wake up around noon, eat cereal straight from the box, and spend hours scrolling through his phone. He'd apply for a few jobs online, get no responses, and then give up for the day. His sister Maria called every few days, but he barely had the energy to talk. She meant well, but her advice about staying positive and networking felt like noise. The apartment building was quiet during the day. Most people were at work, the life David used to have. He'd chosen this place because it was cheap and he could afford it with his small savings. The landlord had mentioned something about mostly older residents, but David didn't care. He just wanted to be left alone. One Tuesday morning, David was making instant coffee when he heard a strange sound from outside. It was like someone struggling, but trying to be quiet about it. He looked out his kitchen window, which faced the small garden area behind the building. An elderly Asian woman was bent over some plants, clearly having trouble standing up straight. She looked to be in her 70s, wearing a simple blue sweater and garden gloves that seemed too big for her hands. Her movements were slow and careful, like someone who wasn't quite sure of their balance. David watched as she tried to lift a watering can, but her left hand wouldn't cooperate properly. The can slipped and water spilled everywhere. David felt something stir inside him, the first real emotion he'd felt in weeks. Without thinking, he put down his coffee and headed outside. The morning air was crisp and smelled like autumn leaves. As he got closer, he could see the woman was frustrated, but trying not to show it. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Her eyes were kind but tired, and when she saw David, she seemed surprised. Most people in the building just walked past without acknowledging her. David wasn't sure what to say, so he just pointed to the watering can and raised his eyebrows in a questioning way. The woman's face lit up with genuine relief. She nodded and stepped back. Gesturing toward the plants, David picked up the watering can and began helping her water the small garden. As he worked, he noticed how carefully she watched each plant, pointing to specific ones that needed more water or less. She couldn't speak clearly. David realized she'd probably had a stroke, but she communicated everything she needed through gentle touches, pointing, and expressions. When he watered one plant too much, she placed her hand lightly on his arm and shook her head with a smile. When he did something right, her whole face would brighten. They worked together for about 20 minutes. David found himself actually enjoying the simple task. There was something peaceful about focusing on just one thing, helping these plants grow. He hadn't felt useful in months, but this woman clearly needed his help and was grateful for it when they finished. She walked over to a small bench near the garden and sat down heavily. She patted the space next to her, inviting David to sit. He hesitated. He wasn't used to spending time with people anymore, but something about her calm presence made him feel safe. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a few birds hop around the garden. The woman pulled out a small notebook and pen from her pocket. With shaky handwriting, she wrote "Thank you" and showed it to David. Then she wrote "Mrs. Chen" and pointed to herself. David introduced himself, and she smiled and nodded. She wrote something else, "Garden needs help. I try," but she gestured to her left side, which David now realized didn't work properly since her stroke. Something about her honest admission touched David deeply. Here was someone who was struggling, but still trying to take care of something beautiful. She wasn't complaining or feeling sorry for herself. She was just looking for a way to keep going. They sat together for a while longer, not talking but somehow communicating. Mrs. Chen would point to different plants and David would nod, somehow understanding that she was sharing stories about each one. Her face would change with each plant, sometimes proud, sometimes worried, always caring. When David finally stood to leave, Mrs. Chen reached into a small bag she carried and pulled out a tiny potted plant. It had small, white flowers and looked Delicate but healthy, she held it out to David with both hands, like she was giving him something precious. David was surprised. Nobody had given him a gift in months. He took the plant carefully, and Mrs. Chen smiled the warmest smile he'd seen in forever. She placed her hand over her heart and then reached out to touch his arm gently, without words. She was telling him that his help meant everything to her. As David walked back to his apartment, carrying the small plant, he felt different, lighter somehow, for the first time in months. He'd done something that mattered to someone else. Mrs. Chen had needed him, and he'd been able to help. It was such a simple thing, but it felt huge. That evening, David placed the plant on his windowsill where it would get morning sun. As he looked at it, he thought about Mrs. Chen and how she'd managed to say so much without saying anything at all. Her gratitude had been so pure and genuine. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? The next morning, David woke up earlier than usual. He made coffee and stood by his window, looking out at the garden. Mrs. Chen was there again, moving slowly among the plants. David found himself smiling as he watched her careful, loving attention to each flower and leaf. He was still unemployed. He still didn't know what he was going to do with his life. But for the first time in months, David felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still some good in the world. And somehow, this quiet woman who spoke without words had reminded him of that truth. David found himself waking up earlier each day, not because he had anywhere to go, but because he was curious about Mrs. Chen. From his window, he could see her in the garden every morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, she moved slowly but with purpose, checking on each plant like they were old friends. After a week of watching, David started timing his coffee breaks to match her garden visits. He'd grab his cup and casually walk outside, pretending he just happened to be there. Mrs. Chen would smile and nod when she saw him, and somehow they'd end up working together without any words being spoken. David began to notice things about Mrs. Chen that amazed him. She could tell which plants needed water just by looking at them. She gently touched the soil and then looked at David with either approval or concern. When she was worried about a plant, her eyebrows would furrow and she'd point to specific leaves, showing David exactly what was wrong. One morning, David watched Mrs. Chen examine a wilting flower. She shook her head sadly and made a cutting motion with her fingers. David understood. The plant was dying and needed to be trimmed, but instead of just cutting it, she showed him how to find the right spot, how to angle the cut, how to be gentle, but decisive. Her hands guided his, and he felt like he was learning an ancient skill. The strange thing was, David had never cared about plants before, but Mrs. Chen's passion was infectious. The way she celebrated when a new bud appeared, the way she'd gently stake a falling stem, it was like watching someone care for something with complete devotion. David found himself actually looking forward to these quiet morning sessions. After 2 weeks of garden meetings, David decided to learn more about Mrs. Chen's condition. He wasn't being nosy, he just wanted to understand how to communicate with her better. The building manager mentioned that a physical therapist visited Mrs. Chen twice a week. David worked up the courage to introduce himself to Dr. Kim, a friendly woman who'd been helping Mrs. Chen recover. Dr. Kim explained that Mrs. Chen had suffered a stroke 6 months ago. She'd lost most of her speech ability, but her mind was completely sharp. She was a teacher for 40 years, Dr. Kim said. She understands everything perfectly. She just can't express it the way she used to. This information hit David hard. Mrs. Chen had been a teacher. No wonder she had such patience with him. She was still teaching, just in a different way. David realized she'd been showing him things about patience, attention, and care that he'd never learned before. The next morning, David paid closer attention to how Mrs. Chen communicated. She didn't just point and gesture randomly. Every movement had meaning. When she wanted him to water something, she'd make a specific hand motion. When she was pleased with his work, she'd clasp her hands together and nod. When she was concerned, she'd tilt her head and make a questioning expression. David started responding with his own gestures. He'd point to his chest when he wanted to help with something. He'd make a thumbs up when he understood what she wanted, slowly. They developed their own silent language. One Saturday, David was at the grocery store, standing in the frozen food section with a cart full of his usual meals, pizza, TV dinners, instant noodles. He was reaching for another frozen meal when he heard a familiar sound. Mrs. Chen was nearby, carefully examining vegetables in the produce section. David watched her shop and realized something embarrassing. She was buying fresh ingredients, vegetables, fruits, herbs. Her cart looked like a rainbow compared to his collection of brown boxes. Mrs. Chen noticed him and smiled, then looked at his cart with an expression that wasn't judgmental, just sad. She gestured for him to follow her. Mrs. Chen moved through the produce section like she was reading a story. She'd pick up a tomato and smell it, then either nod approvingly or shake her head and put it back. She showed David how to tell if an avocado was ripe by gently pressing it. She demonstrated how to choose the best lettuce by looking at the color and feeling the leaves. David felt like a child learning about the world for the first time. Mrs. Chen wasn't just showing him how to pick vegetables. She was teaching him about taking care of himself. Her message was clear. You deserve fresh, good food. You deserve to nourish yourself properly. She picked out ingredients for what David assumed was a simple stir-fry. Then she looked at his cart and raised her eyebrows questioningly. David felt embarrassed but also curious. He put back half of his frozen meals and let Mrs. Chen guide him through choosing fresh alternatives. At the checkout, Mrs. Chen watched as David paid for his groceries. She had a small notebook with her and wrote something down, then showed it to him. Cooking is caring for yourself. David nodded, understanding that this was another lesson, not just about food but about self-worth. That evening, David tried to cook a simple meal with his new ingredients. He burned the vegetables and overcooked the rice, but it still tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. More importantly, the act of cooking, of caring for himself, made him feel more human. The next morning, Mrs. Chen was in the garden as usual. When she saw David, she smiled and made a gesture like she was eating, then raised her eyebrows questioningly. David laughed and made a so-so gesture with his hand, indicating his cooking hadn't been perfect. Mrs. Chen laughed too, a quiet, raspy sound that David realized he'd never heard before. She gestured for him to wait, then went to her apartment and came back with a small piece of paper. It was a simple recipe, written in her careful handwriting, easy vegetable rice. Below it, she'd drawn little pictures showing each step. David looked at the recipe and then at Mrs. Chen. She'd taken the time to write this out for him. Knowing he'd struggled with cooking, it was such a simple gesture, but it felt like the most thoughtful gift he'd ever received. As the days passed, David began to understand that Mrs. Chen was teaching him about much more than gardening and cooking. She was showing him how to pay attention, how to be present, how to care for things, including himself. Her silent lessons were changing him in ways he didn't fully understand yet, but he could feel the difference every morning in the garden, every gentle correction, every encouraging nod. Mrs. Chen was speaking to him in a language that went deeper than words, and slowly, David was learning to speak it back. David had been helping Mrs. Chen in the garden for almost a month when something unexpected happened. She was struggling to reach a high branch that needed pruning, and David could see the frustration on her face. But instead of just helping her cut the branch, Mrs. Chen gestured for him to follow her inside her apartment. David had never been inside before. He felt nervous but curious as Mrs. Chen unlocked her door and invited him in. The apartment was small but felt warm and lived in. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them showing Mrs. Chen throughout different stages of her life. Mrs. Chen made tea while David looked around. The photos told an incredible story. There were pictures of her as a young woman in what looked like a classroom, surrounded by children. Other photos showed her at various school events, always smiling, always surrounded by students who clearly adored her. When Mrs. Chen brought the tea, David pointed to one of the photos and raised his eyebrows questioningly. Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up. She sat down next to David and began pointing to different pictures. using gestures and expressions to tell him stories. In one photo, she was receiving some kind of award. Mrs. Chen pointed to herself in the picture, then made a gesture, like she was teaching, then pointed to her heart. David understood. Teaching hadn't just been her job, it had been her passion. Another photo showed her with a man who was clearly her husband. They were standing in front of a small house, both grinning widely. Mrs. Chen touched the photo gently, then looked at David with sad eyes. She didn't need to explain. David could see the loss in her expression. But then Mrs. Chen showed him something that made David's heart skip. She led him to a corner of the living room where there was a small desk covered with art supplies. Pencils, charcoal, watercolors, and sketchbooks were neatly arranged. She picked up one of the sketchbooks and opened it. The pages were filled with beautiful drawings, flowers from the garden, birds, scenes from around the neighborhood. The artwork was simple but skilled, and David could feel the love and attention in every line. Mrs. Chen had been drawing her world, capturing the beauty she saw every day. Mrs. Chen noticed David staring at the drawings with fascination. She handed him a pencil and pointed to a blank page, then made a drawing motion with her hand. David shook his head quickly. He hadn't drawn anything in months before his life fell apart. He'd been a graphic designer, but he lost all confidence in his creative abilities. Mrs. Chen seemed to understand his hesitation. She sat down and began sketching something simple, a flower from the garden. They'd been working on together. Her movements were slow because of her stroke, but determined. She drew the basic shape, then handed the pencil to David and pointed to the petals. David felt scared but couldn't refuse. His hand was shaking as he tried to add details to Mrs. Chen's drawing. The lines were rough and uncertain, but Mrs. Chen nodded encouragingly. She guided his hand gently, showing him how to make the petals look more natural. For the first time in months, David was creating something. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Mrs. Chen watched him with the same patient attention she gave to her plants. When he finished adding the petals, she smiled and wrote in her notebook, "Beautiful. You have gift." David felt tears coming to his eyes. He'd forgotten that he had any talents at all. Mrs. Chen saw his emotion and patted his hand gently. She turned to a fresh page and began drawing something else, a simple sketch of the two of them, working in the garden together. As she drew, David realized something powerful. Mrs. Chen wasn't just teaching him about gardening or cooking or art. She was teaching him about seeing beauty in everyday moments. She was showing him that creativity and care were the same thing. Both required attention, patience, and love. Mrs. Chen finished her drawing and showed it to David. It was simple but perfect, two figures among flowers, working together peacefully. She wrote below it, "Friends help each other grow." David understood. Mrs. Chen had been helping him grow, just like the plants in the garden. She'd been patient with him, encouraging him, showing him what he was capable of. And somehow, without saying a word, she made him believe in himself again. They spent the rest of the afternoon drawing together. Mrs. Chen would start a sketch and David would add to it, or vice versa. They drew the garden, the birds they'd seen, even the building they lived in. With each drawing, David felt more confident, more like himself. When it was time to leave, Mrs. Chen gave David a small sketchbook and some pencils. She wrote in her notebook, "Practice every day. Art is healing." David promised he would, and he meant it. Walking back to his apartment, David felt different. The sketchbook felt heavy in his hands, but not in a bad way. It felt full of possibility. Mrs. Chen had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever: his creativity, his confidence, his sense of purpose. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table and opened the sketchbook. He started with something simple, the little plant Mrs. Chen had given him on their first day together. As he drew, he thought about how much had changed since then. He was still unemployed, still uncertain about his future, but he no longer felt hopeless. Mrs. Chen had shown him that he had value, that he had gifts to offer the world. She'd done this not through words of encouragement or advice, but through her quiet faith in him. Her patience had taught him patience. Her attention to detail had taught him to notice beauty. Her determination despite her challenges had taught Him that obstacles didn't have to stop him. The next morning, David woke up excited to show Mrs. Chen his drawing. But when he looked out his window, she wasn't in the garden. He waited an hour, then two. But she didn't appear. David started to worry. Mrs. Chen was always in the garden at 8 o'clock exactly. He decided to check on her. When he knocked on her door, he heard movement inside, but it took a long time for her to answer. When she finally opened the door, David could see she wasn't feeling well. She was pale and moving even more slowly than usual. Mrs. Chen tried to smile and wave him away, not wanting to worry him, but David could see she needed help. Without being asked, he went to her kitchen and made tea the way he'd seen her do it. He brought it to her and sat with her on the couch. Mrs. Chen looked at David with such gratitude. She wrote in her notebook, "You take care of me now." David realized that their relationship had changed. He wasn't just learning from her anymore. He was becoming someone who could give back, someone who could care for others the way she'd cared for him. As they sat together in comfortable silence, David understood that Mrs. Chen had been preparing him for this moment. She'd been teaching him not just skills, but how to be the kind of person who notices when others need help, who steps up without being asked, who gives without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Chen had been his teacher all along, and now he was ready to be her friend. David's worst fears came true on a cold Wednesday morning. He was having his usual coffee by the window when he saw an ambulance parked outside the building. His heart sank as he watched paramedics wheeling someone out on a stretcher. Even from his window, he could see the blue sweater that Mrs. Chen always wore. He rushed downstairs and caught Dr. Kim, who was following the ambulance. She had chest pains this morning. Dr. Kim explained quickly. Her neighbor called 911. She's stable, but they're keeping her in the hospital for a few days for observation. David felt lost. For the past month, Mrs. Chen had been the brightest part of his day. Now she was gone, and he didn't know what to do with himself. He wandered back to his apartment and stared out at the empty garden. The plants looked lonely. Without her there, that afternoon, David realized something important. Mrs. Chen had been teaching him to take care of things, but he never had to do it alone. Now was his chance to prove that he'd learned her lessons. He gathered the watering can and went to the garden. At first, he felt overwhelmed. There were so many plants, and he wasn't sure he remembered everything Mrs. Chen had taught him. But as he started working, her voice seemed to guide him. He could almost hear her gentle corrections, see her encouraging nods. David remembered how she'd shown him to test the soil with his finger before watering. He remembered which plants needed more water and which needed less. Slowly, he worked his way through the entire garden, trying to care for it the way Mrs. Chen would have wanted. As he worked, other residents began to notice. Mrs. Peterson from the second floor stopped to watch him. "You're the young man who's been helping Mrs. Chen," she said. "That's very kind of you to keep up with her garden." David felt a strange sense of pride. He wasn't just helping anymore. He was responsible for something that mattered. The next morning, he was back in the garden again, and Mrs. Peterson joined him. She didn't know much about plants, but she was willing to learn. By the third day, word had spread through the building. Mr. Rodriguez from the first floor brought some plant food he'd bought. Mrs. Johnson contributed a new hose when she noticed the old one was leaking. Even the teenager from the top floor, who David had never spoken to before, offered to help with the heavier work. David found himself becoming a teacher, just like Mrs. Chen had been. He showed Mrs. Peterson how to deadhead flowers. He taught Mr. Rodriguez about pruning. He guided Mrs. Johnson in replanting some herbs that needed more space. Without realizing it, he was using the same patient, wordless teaching methods that Mrs. Chen had used with him. But David wanted to do something more personal for Mrs. Chen. He remembered the sketchbook she'd given him and got an idea. He started drawing pictures of the garden, capturing each plant and flower in detail. But these weren't just drawings. They were like a diary of everything that had happened. While she was gone, he drew Mrs. Peterson learning to water the roses. He sketched Mr. Rodriguez proudly showing off his pruning skills. He captured Mrs. Johnson's excitement when she successfully replanted the herbs. Each drawing told a story. about how Mrs. Chen's garden had brought the whole building together. David also drew pictures of Mrs. Chen herself, memories of their time together in the garden. He drew her gentle hands guiding his as they planted seeds. He sketched her patient expression as she taught him about different flowers. He captured her joy when she saw a plant blooming for the first time. The drawings became a visual story of their friendship and everything she'd taught him. David realized he was creating something that would show Mrs. Chen how much she'd changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the building. On Friday, David got permission to visit Mrs. Chen in the hospital. He brought the sketchbook with him, nervous but excited to share what he'd been working on. When he walked into her room, Mrs. Chen's face lit up with the biggest smile he'd ever seen from her. She looked tired but alert. David showed her the sketchbook page by page, explaining each drawing through gestures and expressions the way she'd taught him. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears as she saw how he captured their memories and how he'd brought the whole building together around her garden. When David showed her the drawing of all the neighbors working together, Mrs. Chen clasped her hands together and placed them over her heart. She was so proud, not just of the garden, but of what David had become. He was no longer the lost, isolated person she'd first met. He was someone who could lead, teach, and bring people together. Mrs. Chen wrote in her notebook, "You understand. Now, this is what teaching really means." David nodded, finally grasping the full lesson. Mrs. Chen hadn't just been teaching him about plants or art or cooking. She'd been teaching him about community, about caring for others, about finding his place in the world. A nurse came in to check on Mrs. Chen, and David prepared to leave. But Mrs. Chen held up her hand, asking him to wait. She wrote something else in her notebook and showed it to him. "You don't need me to tell you what to do anymore. You know in your heart." David felt a mix of pride and sadness. He was proud of how much he'd grown, but sad to think that maybe he didn't need Mrs. Chen's guidance anymore. But as he looked at her warm, encouraging expression, he realized that wasn't what she meant at all. She wasn't saying goodbye to their friendship. She was telling him that he'd learned the most important lesson of all: how to trust himself, how to listen to his inner voice, how to act with kindness and purpose without needing someone else to show him the way. Walking out of the hospital, David felt different than he had in months. He wasn't just Mrs. Chen's student anymore. He was ready to be a teacher himself. He was ready to pass on the lessons of patience, care, and silent wisdom that she'd given him. The garden was waiting for him, and so were the neighbors who'd become his friends. David had learned that the most important things in life weren't taught through words, but through actions, example, and the simple act of caring for others. Mrs. Chen had prepared him for this moment without him even knowing it. Now it was his turn to carry on what she'd started. Mrs. Chen came home from the hospital on a sunny Saturday morning. David was waiting in the garden with all the neighbors who'd been helping while she was gone. When she saw the garden, more beautiful than ever, with new flowers planted and everything perfectly cared for, she stopped and stared in amazement. But it wasn't just the garden that had changed. David had organized the neighbors into a real community. Mrs. Peterson had started bringing fresh cookies every morning. Mr. Rodriguez had built new wooden planters. Mrs. Johnson had created a small herb section where everyone could take what they needed for cooking. Mrs. Chen looked at David with such pride. She could see that he wasn't the same lost person she'd met months ago. He stood taller now, spoke more confidently, and had a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Most importantly, he learned to care for others the way she'd cared. For him, David had been planning a surprise for Mrs. Chen's return. He'd been working on something special, a project that would show her how much her silent teaching had meant to him and to everyone in the building. He'd started offering art classes in the community room every Tuesday and Thursday evening. At first, only Mrs. Peterson had shown up, curious about what David was doing. But word spread quickly. Soon, residents from all over the building were coming to learn basic drawing and painting. David taught the way Mrs. Chen had taught him. With patience, encouragement, and very few words, he'd show people how to hold a pencil properly, how to see the shapes in everyday objects, how to capture light and shadow. But mostly, He taught them to be kind to themselves and to find joy in creating something with their own hands. The classes became about more than just art. They became a place where neighbors who'd never spoken before became friends. Mrs. Peterson discovered she had a talent for drawing birds. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been embarrassed about his shaky hands, found that watercolor painting actually worked well with his natural tremor. Mrs. Johnson started sketching the plants from the garden, creating a visual record of everything they'd grown together. When Mrs. Chen saw what David had created, she was overwhelmed. She watched from the doorway as he guided a group of children through drawing simple flowers. His voice was gentle but confident, and the children hung on his every word. He'd become the teacher she'd always known he could be. David noticed Mrs. Chen watching and invited her to join the class. She shook her head with a smile, pointing to David and then to herself, then making a gesture that meant you're the teacher. Now, David understood. This was his moment to lead, and she was there to support him, not to take over. After the class ended, David and Mrs. Chen walked through the garden together. The evening light was golden, and the flowers seemed to glow. In the warm air, they sat on the bench where they'd shared their first conversation, back when David had been too scared to even make eye contact. Mrs. Chen pulled out her notebook and wrote, "I have something to tell you." David waited as she continued writing. "I was not just teaching you about plants and art. I was teaching you about yourself." David nodded, understanding flooding through him. All those months of patient guidance, of wordless lessons, of gentle corrections, Mrs. Chen had been showing him who he really was underneath. All the fear and doubt. She wrote more. "You came to me broken, but you were never really broken. You just forgot how to see your own worth. I helped you remember." David felt tears in his eyes. Mrs. Chen had seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself. She believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. Through her silent faith, she taught him that he had value, that he had gifts to share with the world. Mrs. Chen wasn't finished writing. "The greatest lesson is this: we all need each other. You helped me too. You gave me purpose again. You reminded me that I still had something to teach." David realized that their relationship had always been about more than just him learning from her. Mrs. Chen had been lonely too, lost in her own way after her stroke. Taking care of him had given her a reason to keep going, a way to feel useful. Again, they sat together as the sun set, watching the garden they created together. David thought about how much his life had changed since that first morning. When he'd watched Mrs. Chen struggling with the watering can, he'd gone from being completely isolated to being someone who brought people together. His art classes had grown into something bigger. People were talking about starting a garden club, organizing building-wide dinners, maybe even creating a small gallery to display everyone's artwork. David had become the heart of a community that hadn't existed before. But more importantly, David had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the best way to heal yourself is to help others heal. Mrs. Chen had shown him this through her own example. She'd been recovering from her stroke, relearning how to communicate, dealing with the loss of her husband. But instead of focusing on her own problems, she'd chosen to focus on helping David find his way. As the stars came out, Mrs. Chen stood up slowly and placed her hand on David's shoulder. She looked into his eyes and nodded once, firmly, without words. She was telling him that he was ready now, ready to stand on his own, ready to be the person he was meant to be, ready to pass on the lessons she'd taught him. David understood that this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Mrs. Chen would always be part of his life, but now he could also be part of other people's lives in the same way she'd been part of his. They walked back to the building together, comfortable in their shared silence. David helped Mrs. Chen up the stairs to her apartment, and she squeezed his hand goodnight. As he went to his own apartment, David reflected on the incredible journey they'd shared. He'd started as someone who couldn't even take care of himself. Now he was someone who could teach others, who could bring people together, who could see the beauty in everyday moments. Mrs. Chen had given him all of this without ever telling him what to do. She'd simply shown him, through her actions and her faith in him, who he could become. The next morning, David woke up early and looked out his window at the garden. Mrs. Chen was there, moving slowly among the plants, but she wasn't alone. Several neighbors had joined her, and they were all working together, caring for the flowers and vegetables they planted as a community. David smiled and went to join them. As he worked alongside Mrs. Chen and the others, he realized that her greatest lesson hadn't been about gardening or art or cooking. It had been about love, the quiet, patient, wordless love that shows up every day, that believes in people when they can't believe in themselves, that creates beauty wherever it goes. Mrs. Chen had taught him that the most important conversations happen without words, and the most powerful lessons are taught through example. David would carry these lessons with him for the rest of his life, and he would pass them on to others the same way Mrs. Chen had passed them on to him, with patience, with kindness, and with the unwavering belief that every person has something beautiful to offer the world.